watching the Mystical Green Beanie.
Hey, what's going on, dudes and dudettes? I am the Mystical Green Beanie, and welcome to part 5. Or 6? Whichever one it is, I have completely lost count by now. But welcome to the latest part of my Ultimate Spider-Man Mega Review, and today we're finally talking about Miles Morales. We're finally going to dig into the Miles Morales material. Or, you know, at the very least, the first half of it, before the book changes titles and renumbers, which, funny enough, is only 28 issues. Yeah, I thought there was more, but apparently not. It just feels really long. And I don't mean that in a bad way. This is just a very dense comic. So much happens in so little time. Plus, there's a time jump, and then there's a tie-in to a pretty massive event that involves the United States literally collapsing. And then near the end, Galactus from the main Marvel Universe shows up and obliterates New Jersey. So, yeah, forgive me for remembering this series being longer than it actually is. Anyways, before I go any further, let me just say this. For those of you who are angry or unsettled by me giving Miles Morales so much crap in recent months, I'm sorry, but I don't do it because I hate the character. I do it because this series and the series after this that takes place before Secret Wars is so good. It's so freaking good that when I read the crap that we've been getting post Secret Wars, I can't help but get angry, because I know what came before, and I know how good this character and this series can be. Anyways, with that said, I really want to start this off by talking about Miles first, because Miles, right off the bat, is so different from Peter Parker. Aside from the obvious fact that he's, you know, an Afro-Latino kid who's 13 years old, Miles is not a genius. That's the first major difference between the two. Now, Miles is smart, yes, but he's not smart in the same ways that Peter was. For starters, Miles had no idea how to create the web formula that he needed for his web shooters. Hell, he didn't even know how to create his own web shooters. They were given to him by Aunt May, and Miles had Gank, his best friend, make the web fluid. That said, what Miles lacks in terms of scientific prowess, he makes up for by being very practical and very wise, especially for his age. Needless to say, there are moments where he breaks, and we the reader are reminded that Miles is still just a kid who's in way over his head. Miles also has a very different motivation than Peter, but the two, funny enough, do what they do for the exact same reasons. They're both characters who become superheroes because they feel as though someone they looked up to died as a direct result to their failure to act. With Peter, it's obviously Uncle Ben, but with Miles, he feels guilty because he thinks that if he made himself known to Peter Parker earlier, then Peter never would have died. Now, this is where we get into some of the more interesting aspects of Miles and how he differs from Peter. Whereas Peter was establishing himself as Spider-Man in a world where the whole superhero concept was still new, and seeing Iron Man or Thor fly through the city was a novelty, Miles is establishing himself in a world where society is past that. Instead, he's establishing himself in a world where society has been through the horrors of what costume heroism can spawn. This is a world post-Ultimates too. This is a world post-Peter Parker. But more importantly, this is a world post-Ultimatum. And for those of you who don't know what that is, Ultimatum is the event where Magneto floods Manhattan. And this isn't treated like a typical supervillain fiasco. This is treated like 9/11 times 10. There are major consequences for this. Consequences that really affect the way people view superheroes, especially people like Miles' father. But I'll get to that later. Anyways, like I said, Miles was very different from Peter. He's not a gifted scientist like Peter is. He's becoming a superhero in a world where the political and social climate is far more toxic than it ever was during Peter's heyday. But another key difference are the people in his life. Unlike Peter, Miles doesn't really have a steady girlfriend who knows his secret identity. Instead, that role is more or less filled by his best friend Gank. Not that they're romantically involved at all, even though everybody in the book suspects that they are, and that's a running gag throughout the series. But yeah, instead of having a love interest as a confidant, Miles has his best friend. Another key difference is that Miles' parents are still alive, and that makes the drama of him keeping his identity from them very different. Because whereas Peter kept his secret from Aunt May because he didn't want her to stress out after the death of Uncle Ben, Miles keeps his secret because his father hates people with superpowers. Not just mutants, just people with powers in general. And Miles is depicted as being not afraid of his father, but definitely intimidated by him. And it's because of his father's strong, concrete views that Miles is afraid to open up to him, even if he didn't necessarily hold the same beliefs as his father. And as for his mom, he didn't tell her because she's depicted as being very worrisome, and she's the classic overprotective mother type. And another major difference is that, unlike Peter, Miles lives in a dormitory on his school campus, and that makes for some pretty funny drama in terms of keeping a secret safe. But I guess now is a good time to talk about Miles' supporting cast, because even though Bendis kills off some of the characters from the Peter Parker era, and most others are scattered because of the events of Ultimatum and Ultimate Fallout, there are analogs that Bendis creates for Miles. As I already mentioned, Gank is a platonic analog for MJ, Captain America is an analog for Nick Fury, and funny enough, Rio and Jefferson, Miles' parents, are analogs for two aspects of Gwen Stacy, with Jefferson being the analog for Gwen's hatred of Spider-Man due to personal tragedy involving Spider-Man, and Rio being an analog for Gwen's death and how that affects Spider-Man moving forward. And I guess in a certain sense, Jessica Drew is the Fantastic Four rolled into one, and there is a Norman Osborn analog and an analog for Oscorp, and I think they're great, because it's the Roxxon Corporation, and Philip Roxxon is revealed to be the puppet master behind everything. And his whole motivation was to be Norman Osborn 2.0, and now he's obsessed with recreating the Super Soldier Serum and replicating Captain America for an exclusive military contract, and it turns out, from the beginning of the book, he hired Miles' uncle, who was this universe's version of the Prowler, to steal something for him, but then ended up making a new Spider-Man on accident. And that was really cool. Speaking of which, I want to talk about Uncle Aaron for a second. So, Uncle Aaron, aka the Prowler, is Miles' uncle. And I'm not sure if any of this is accidental at all, but Bendis does a thing that I find fascinating. So, the whole concept of Peter Parker Spider-Man is that he does what he does because he felt as though he had a responsibility to his uncle's memory post-mortem. And Uncle Ben is just a great guy. He's a hippie, he's selfless, he's emotionally mature, and he's responsible. But then there's Uncle Aaron, and Uncle Aaron is the exact opposite of Uncle Ben. He's a career criminal, he's selfish, he's immature, and he thinks the world owes him something. And there's a line that he has very early on in the book where he very selfishly tells Miles that he has a responsibility to him. And I just think that's brilliant because Bendis has crafted a cracked mirror version of Uncle Ben and Uncle Aaron, and is taking Peter's selfless motivation and having Uncle Aaron force it upon his nephew. And even though both uncles died through means of senseless acts of violence, whereas Peter's uncle was murdered by a criminal, Miles' uncle killed himself while trying to endanger the lives of people around him. And for me, that very much took the idea of Spider-Man and turned it on its ear, while also staying thematically consistent because after this, the new Spider-Man is branded a murderer and is hunted by the police just like the Spider-Man before him. And again, I just find all of that really fascinating. Something else that I really latched onto, and is the main reason for my sour attitude towards all of the post-Secret Wars Miles Morales material, is how important legacy is to this book. Because, well, Peter Parker died. He was a martyr. And as I said in my last video, Spider-Man was to the Ultimate Universe what Superman is to the DC Universe. So naturally, people grew very protective of the memory and legacy of Peter Parker, especially New Yorkers. And once Miles announced himself to the world, he was rejected. Everyone saw what Miles was doing as disrespectful, because after all, and I've said this in all of my reviews for Ultimate Spider-Man, this is the Ultimate Universe. People are selfish, people are cynical, and people are shallow. It's a world very much like our own, and when people saw Miles jumping around in a Spider-Man costume, they all assumed that his intentions weren't altruistic. They automatically assumed that he was just some kid trying to bank off of the image of Peter Parker, and even though that's not the case, that's how people saw it. But as time went on, people saw that that's not what Miles' motivation was. His motivation was to keep Spider-Man alive, and that New York will always need a Spider-Man, and that's even physically said by Jessica Drew after Miles retires temporarily in the wake of his mother's death. And the other reason why I'm so in love with this idea of legacy within the context of the Ultimate Universe is that Miles is very hung up on trying to be Peter Parker 2.0. And his whole arc is that he shouldn't try to be exactly like Peter Parker. Instead, he should be his own man. And Aunt May has a beautiful moment where she gives Miles Peter's web shooters, and she tells him that instead of trying to do the whole Spider-Man thing like Peter did, he should be his own Spider-Man. He has to figure out what the mask represents to him as opposed to what it represented to Peter. And I love this moment so much because it's a stepping stone for everybody. Miles moves forward as his own Spider-Man. Aunt May and Gwen move on by finally letting go. And MJ moves on by meeting the physical manifestation of what her inner soulmate more or less created in issue 13 of the original Ultimate Spider-Man comic. But what I find interesting is that the three most integral characters in this series, who are Miles, Uncle Aaron, and Philip Roxon, are all trying to be new versions of characters from the previous Ultimate Spider-Man series. Miles, of course, wants to be the new Spider-Man, Uncle Aaron wants to be the new Kingpin, and as I already mentioned, Philip Roxon wants to be the new Norman Osborn. But what's cool about that is that where Philip and Uncle Aaron want to be better versions of the characters they're aping, Miles doesn't. But through karmic justice, everyone gets the opposite of what they want. Uncle Aaron dies before he can become the new Kingpin. Philip Roxon is easily taken out and thrown in prison before he can even try to be as successful as Norman Osborn. But Miles ends up becoming a world-renowned superhero, even bigger than Peter could ever hope to be. Okay, so now I want to talk about the villains, because again, this is something that I really love about this series and absolutely can't stand about the post-Secret Wars Miles Morales content. And it's the fact that Miles actually has a rogues gallery. He has villains that are unique to him. And even though most of them are characters that are already established villains in the main 616 universe, or characters that are typically Peter Parker villains in the main 616 universe, they're repurposed to be Miles Morales villains. And that's what I think was a huge advantage of having Miles Morales be in his own universe. Bendis could either create new villains for Miles to face, or put his own creative spin on a classic character from the main universe and put them against Miles like he did with the Scorpion, and Prowler, and Batroc the Leaper. And he even creates his own version of Venom, who, when I was reading this comic as it was coming out, I didn't know what the big deal with him was. But after rereading it, I found it to be a pretty cool reveal, so I don't want to spoil that in case you haven't read it. Alright, so this review was kind of all over the place and scatterbrained, but on the whole, I really enjoyed it. But I do have some criticisms. First off, Bendis does a thing that I really don't like. And it's this pseudo Joss Whedon OMG quirky dialogue. And to be fair to this series, this isn't something that started here necessarily. I mean, hell, it's not even something that started in the previous Ultimate Spider-Man book. This is actually a problem that Bendis started having in his run on the New Avengers. Like, after the story arc where he introduces the Century, the writing starts to slowly decline in quality, and then it just nosedives during Civil War, but that's neither here nor there. The point is, this isn't a problem that's exclusive to this book, but it's worth mentioning. And I don't hate quirky dialogue, and in fact, Bendis has always had a quirky, self-aware writing style, but the thing is, it was well written. And here, and even in a lot of the Ultimate Spider-Man Reborn material after Ultimatum, his writing started to feel more and more Tumblr-y. But for the most part, the voices for these characters are consistent and faithful. All the Peter Parker characters sound like they should, and they all have unique voices. And I gotta give it to them, all the black people sound like, black people. And they're not caricatures of black people, or black people that sound like, I don't know, like a white person who's afraid of coming off as a racist would write a black person. They just sound like black people from Brooklyn. Which is high marks because that's a problem that I've noticed in comics, especially in recent years. As for the art, it's done by a few people, but it's mostly Sarah Pacelli and Dave Marquez, who are both phenomenal. But if I'm gonna be completely honest here, they're very similar. Like, I had to look up who was doing the art for some of the issues because they're both very similar. But yeah, the art's fantastic, and there's more than a few pages that I think are exceptional and would love to have prints of to hang on my wall. But yeah, guys, I absolutely loved this, and I had so much fun going back and reading all of this stuff. It was just so much fun. The writing is on point for the most part, the characters are all fun and well written, and reading this reminded me why I love Miles, especially nowadays, because recently, Miles has just become a nothing character. And I was starting to forget why I was so in love with this character in the first place, and this is exactly what I needed. Anyways, what about you guys? Have you read the first volume of the Miles Morales Spider-Man book? Did you like it, or were you just not a fan? And if you are one of those people who just didn't connect with it, let me know down below in the comment section. Anyways guys, if you like this video, hit the like button, share, support the channel, and if you want to see more content like this, all you have to do is subscribe. I'm the Mystical Green Beanie. Thank you for watching, and as always, until next time, adios nachos.